Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, and is always available for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. And thank you so much for joining me. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we're taking a trip to Cuba with an array of guests whose stories you don't want to miss. Joining me at my table, Ramiro A. Fernandez, Cecilia M. Fernandez, Ana Sophia Pelaez, Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo, and Michael Connors. All of today's guests will be joining me at the Miami Book Fair International, November 16th through 23rd at Miami-Dade College in downtown Miami. But before we begin, a brief message from our sponsors. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com and at a host of venues. But do be sure to visit us at our newest home on iHeartRadio. Today, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Listen to audiobooks whenever and wherever you want. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. With over 150,000 titles in virtually every genre, you'll find what you're looking for. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by signing up at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne, host of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. Join me November 16th through 23rd at the nation's largest book fair, the 31st Miami Book Fair International in warm and sunny Miami at Miami-Dade College. Mingle with 400-plus authors from around the world, including Patricia Cornwell, Dave Barry, John Dean, Philip Margolin, Anne Rice, Elizabeth Nunez, and Joanna Rakoff. Listen to the authors read their own words, answer your questions, and autograph your books. For more information, visit MiamiBookFair.com and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. See you there. Hello, I'm Halli Casser-Jayne, host of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Join me Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, when I talk with the great artists, writers, musicians, politicians, and celebrities of our day. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is talk radio for fine minds. Tune in live or listen to the podcast at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Born in Havana, Cuba, Ramiro A. Fernandez was 8 years old his last year in Cuba. The revolution forced his family to flee the island they loved. They eventually settled in Palm Beach County, Florida. Fernandez graduated from Florida State University in 1974 and worked as a photo editor for Time Inc., a 25-year career. He's a contributing photo editor to America's Quarterly. Inspired by his grandmother, Fernandez began collecting photographs of Cuba in 1981, building an anthology of images to document aspects of human life, history, art, and culture before they disappeared. His collection includes a mixture of family, tourist, and professional photos from the late 1800s through the Cuban Revolution. Some of these images were published in I Was Cuba, Treasures from the Ramiro Fernandez collection. His new book, Cuba Then, with a foreword and poems by Richard Blanco. It's a tribute to Cuba's glamorous past. So, as you say, you were 8 years old your last year in Cuba. Share with us what you remember of your first home, the revolution. You remember seeing Castro, in fact, right?
Castro was attending a conference right across the street from where my sister used to go to school, which was roughly about 4 or 5 blocks from my house. And it was an all prissy girls' school. And he came out to the kids that were lining up in the sidewalk, and he said hello to every one of us. But the first home that I remember where we moved to in Miami was in Opalaca on 27th Street and 171st Street. And it was all gringo school. And I had already begun to learn English, so it was a real swift, total immersion course. And I actually started, to speak English in about 2 years.
That's pretty good. What do you remember of Cuba besides that moment with Castro? Do you remember much of that chapter?
Oh, I remember tons. I mean, the Castro chapter is just a tiny hair. Well, between my mother and school, I managed to go out and be part of sort of like outside trips that kind of piqued my interest in a lot of things. My mother took me to industrial fairs. My dad took me to the movies. And at school, I was able to go to a sugar mill. We went to sponge factories. We went to caves. We went to, a combination between natural resources and industrial things that showed me, the different industries that Cuba was involved in, besides sugar and tobacco and things like that.
So was it traumatic for you to leave? Or that just kind of at 8 years old, it was just another thing?
Well, to an 8-year-old, it was real. It was a real adventure to go someplace. The dawn of leaving Cuba was about, a week and a half after we had come to the United States, and I had to go to a new school, and we had moved in out of the hotel that we first landed in downtown Miami. And it was me and my sister and my mom. My dad stayed on, and we left in October of 1960, and my dad didn't really join us till the following year, March, a month before the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Wow. So your family, like many, left in exile. And for your grandmother, this is a part of your story that I like. Not only was the life she knew left behind, but she feared the essence of what Cuba was would be lost forever. And she's actually the one who encouraged you to start collecting these images that you collect for this phenomenal book. Just phenomenal.
Well, my grandmother lived right above El Parque Central, which is the main square in Havana, which means that a lot of activity kind of streams out of this park, dedicated to Jose Marti. And she lived in an early 19th century hotel called El Telégrafo. And it was a hotel that was occupied by writers and poets and artists and things like that, and people that lived on a pension. Well, my grandmother lived there, and she was soaked in Cuban culture, its history, its customs. She knew the streets well in Old Havana. And when she moved to the United States, she got her little apartment in Little Havana, and she decorated her walls from cutouts from her neighborhood, and her neighborhood, of course, is Old Havana. It's one of the most beautiful heritage, well-known neighborhoods in the world, or districts. And so it was this visual link when I was visiting her that kind of sparked my whole sort of like admiration and love for Cuba. And she kind of like pushed me along when I started collecting when I was 27 years old.
So where do you find these images?
Well, I find them all over. I find them from private dealers. I find them from book dealers. I go to antiquarians. I find them from auction houses. They're everywhere.
Okay.
You just have to find them, maybe not so much under the spelling of Cuba, but Latin American, early imagery, Caribbean, head topics that may lead you to these images. 19th century life, plantation life, key topics. And of course, I have images that go from the beginning of photography. So it's from 1852, 53 on to like 1970 is the span of the collection.
And what is in this book boggles the mind. What's interesting to me, one of the first photographs in the book is this black and white image of an airliner, circa 1959, Cubana company, I think it said on the airline. Going or coming, symbolic? Why'd you pick that photo, put that photo there?
Well, that picture kind of like brings you into the book. See, there's two ways of entry when you come into the book. One is by air, which is that Constellation TW airplane you have, and the second is by boat. And those were the two main ways into coming into Havana. So when I put those images in the front, it kind of like brings the viewer down into the body of the book.
Perfect.
You're traveling.
Yeah, perfect.
And,
absolutely
and
perfect.
I wanted to pick a constellation because it's so heraldic looking and it's so visual. It's got ins and outs. It's like a serrated knife. It's a beautiful piece of machinery.
Absolutely. So many images of so many things in this book. Celebrities is one. My goodness. I mean, who's not in that book? I'm going to tell you my favorite. You have a phenomenal image of Prince Edward in that book. Oh, my God. What a look on that man's face. But do you have a favorite?
I have a lot of favorites. What happens is that we started with about 600 photographs, 700 photographs, and it came down to those 249. I think it's either 249 or 262, somewhere in that neighborhood. So, it's hard for me to pick out one in particular, but my favorite, of course, is the image of my mother, who's in the book At the Car Races, which is the last official Grand Prix car race in Havana. And I'm to the left of her, and there's some other family friends in the photograph.
Yeah, it's like I said, but there are so many images of so many different things. The romance that was pre-Castro Cuba is so gorgeously captured in this collection. We can't talk Cuba and not talk music and dance and entertainment and fun and mambo. And, oh my gosh, and singers to come out of Cuba. I'm thinking, talk to me about it.
There's too many to put. I can just do a book on music alone.
Oh, I know.
And that would be a great thing to do. It's very rich. It's very varied. And, that accounts for a lot of the different ethnic groups that came into Cuba and shaped and colorized the music heritage. And we were lucky that we had so many people from all different backgrounds, especially from Africa. Everybody says, oh, you got blacks. Yeah, but there were different groups of black, each bringing in their own individual flavor, rhythm, and knowledge of their different backgrounds. And also to Spain, there's influences from Spain, but there's also different parts of Spain that brought their juju in. So it's everybody helped to put that combo or that music together.
Yeah, that music. But island life was also tough, and a lot of these photographs paint, I think, a true picture of the entire cycle of life from, the poor to the high. Here's where I'm going with that, and that is some of the images you've collected, the campesinos and the fishermen, and the melancholy sugarcane workers sweating in the sun. Those just touch so deeply when you look at them. You must have had fun picking those out too, yes?
Yes. Well, because what happens is that, I wanted to do landscape, but what happens when you do landscape in the country like Cuba, we have a lot of sun, and our dusk and our sunsets are very, very short time. So photography doesn't cast a lot of shadows. So in order to compensate for the landscape, you actually pick faces in which you can read the topography and the history of the land through the faces. So that's what I did. I substituted faces and different ethnic backgrounds to colorize the landscape and the field and the history of the people.
And it works because it's almost like the climate is etched in people's faces.
Exactly.
And that just, you just wanted to just put your finger on the images. You could feel every crease that every person had earned. Hurricanes, boxing, gangsters, one of my favorite parts of Cuba in the pre-Cuba.
The shady operators is what I call them.
The shady operators. And there's also another photograph that I just, oh my gosh, and that's of the SS, the ill-fated, I should say, SS St. Louis.
Oh, that's a long history. That's a whole chapter. There are chapters in Cuban history which the world was or zeroed in on. That one, and of course, the other one was the missile crisis of 1962. Yeah. When you do a history book, of a small country, I think it's imperative to bring into play some element of world history, and that way you can get a sense of what was happening or emanating from such a tiny little spot that kind of reverberated back to what was to come, because that boat leaving Havana Harbor is 1939, a month before Hitler invaded Poland. So it's kind of like a dark curtain, on the world history stage, that SS leaving Havana Harbor.
Such a tiny little island, so many
and making all that noise. I know,
right? It's extraordinary to me. So from hedonism, I'm thinking of the Tropicana. I'm thinking of the circus characters. I'm thinking about Josephine Baker makes the cover of your book because she was there.
Yes.
To revolution, there are some stark photos of Soviet surface-to-air missiles on parade in Revolutionary Square in Havana in the book. One image in particular of a young boy after the revolution draped with a bandolier. Oh my gosh.
Oh yes, that is an extremely powerful image.
Right?
Actually, I'm glad you zeroed in on that. If you look at that closely, it's a very interesting shot just by the way that the light is, he's sitting in a clearing, in a forest, and you see that the light is coming from above like a spotlight. And he is draped in the bandolier of bullets that was left over by the revolution that was going on around him. That's in the Sierra Maestra Mountains where the fighting was going on. So that's a grim reminder of the remains of war. And the bayonet, and of course the bandolier is bigger than
he
him.
is.
That is, I agree.
Yeah.
That is, you zeroed in on the one.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, oh my gosh. And then, of course, there's the Fidel Castro. There's an image of him peering through the sight of an MK-50.
Oh, yeah. That's another way of looking at him.
Where did you find that image? I mean, I would think that he would want to own every image ever taken of him. Where did you? There's
a lot of things that are out there now that are leaving or have left Cuba that were not sort of like date approved. And those are the kind of images that they have never gone out of their way to print. I believe that photograph was left in an archive. It was not used. It managed to come out to the West, and I found it, and I thought it was good to show.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you a question, Ramiro. Was your grandmother right? A culture lost forever? There's a gorgeous quote in this book. It's an image of a souvenir card with an inspirational quote by poet and revolutionary Jose Marti. I'm going to spare everybody my Spanish. I'm going to say it in English. What matters is not that we triumph, but that our country is happy. Happiness lost, paradise lost.
That is a poem that, as you well see, it's on a postcard.
Right.
So it was really meant for commercial mass market. But the tone of it speaks of seeking happiness, yet at the same time, we still have a melancholy heart. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, I understand it perfectly. I'm just, I guess I'm taking it back to your grandmother, so worried that the culture, everything was going to be lost, and that just makes me crazy. And I was wondering whether you have hope for something better.
Well, I'm always thinking of something better. I don't think the culture has been lost entirely.
So it's not lost, it's just veiled behind a iron curtain, if you will.
It's the culture in Cuba comes and goes. It's very much like the tide and the flooded streets around the Malecón. It comes and goes. It comes and goes.
It comes and goes. I've been speaking with Ramiro A. Fernandez, author of Cuba Then, Rare and Classic Images from the extensive Ramiro A. Fernandez collection, with a foreword and poems by Richard Blanco, the Cuban-American poet chosen to speak at President Obama's second inauguration by way of the Monticelli Press. Cecilia M. Fernandez is an independent journalist and college instructor who has reported for the Stockton Record, the San Francisco Chronicle, and numerous Miami television stations. She covered the Florida State Legislature, the National Democratic Convention, Operation Desert Storm, Hurricane Andrew, the Mariel Boat Lift, and more. Her work has appeared in Latina Magazine, Accent Miami. Fernandez is an Emmy nominee, received Dartmouth University's Champion Tuck Award, and among others, the Scripps Howard Award. She earned an MFA in Creative Writing from Florida International University, an MA in English Literature from the University of Miami, and a BA in Journalism and Social Science from the University of California, Berkeley. Leaving Little Havana, a memoir of Miami's Cuban ghetto, tells her story, that of a 6-year-old young girl uprooted by a revolution, forced into exile from her comfortable middle-class Cuban home, dropped into the low-income neighborhood of Miami's Little Havana. Leaving Little Havana is the first refugee memoir to focus on a Cuban girl growing up in America, rising above all obstacles, and clearing her own path in order to realize her dream. So, Cecilia, you were 6 years old when you were uprooted from your comfortable middle-class Cuban home. Do you remember anything at all about Cuba?
Yes, I definitely remember quite a bit. My school, all the people that my mother had employed in the house, like my particular nanny, the cook. There was somebody that cleaned. Also, my teachers, all the neighbors. Everything is very, very vivid.
So you found yourself, as you say, dropped. That was the word that you used, in the low-income neighborhood of Miami's Little Havana. I can't even imagine that kind of transition. I don't care if you're 6 or you're 106. That's still a big difference, no?
Yes, and it was more to my mother than to me because I was having a lot of fun with my new friends, my new school, and new language. Everything was just so exciting for me. Dressing up for Halloween, being in the play on stage, all of these things were just taking up all of my energy. So I really wasn't too cognizant of the class levels and the lack of money until a lot later when I started writing that book and just making things gel. And of course, the main thing about my life is that my father was the one who really left us in this ghetto. He moved on to greener pastures. He finished his internship and his residency at Mount Sinai Hospital. He got himself an office and a new wife, a brand new house. And he kept climbing up the ladder. And we stayed in one spot because mainly my mother had mental illness and had to deal with that along with working and providing what my father couldn't through his very small alimony and child support payments. But I do want to make a comment here that my mom used to be an English teacher in Cuba. She taught for 15 years. So her life was made a lot easier by already knowing the language. And all the people around us, they didn't know anything. They didn't know the language. So it was really a very interesting dynamic going on in Little Havana.
I can just imagine. In Cuba, I want to make this clear, though, your father wasn't practicing doctor yet, right? He wasn't a
No, he was.
Oh, he was
a gynecologist.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So for him to leave that behind and have to, in some senses, start all over, right?
Yes.
Devastating, right? With a family. But he abandoned. And your mom, you said, had mental illness problems throughout your childhood. Her adjustment just wasn't as simple as it might have been, unfortunately. But you did grow up in Little Havana. And this is what I want to ask you. If you feel that you had an American childhood, or in fact you were for all intents and purposes raised in a refugee camp, did you feel American? Was it an American environment, or was it a Cuban environment transplanted to Calle Ocho?
It was totally a Cuban environment. Yes, all the cultural practices, all of the ideas, the moral ideas, like going along on dates, and the whole, I guess that's part of the entire maybe world culture, but it was so pronounced in the Cuban culture about the differences between men and women and not letting anybody kiss you until you get married, and the place of the woman in the home and wanting a husband and a house. Yes, it was very, very Cuban. And I've never really gotten away from that. I've never really been able to overcome that. Even though I was only 6, I write in English. I couldn't even begin to write in Spanish. It just doesn't flow. I went to all my schools were all in English. I went away to the university. So it's just a very confusing kind of thing. I don't see myself, I don't even know what I see myself as. I'm still confused.
Isn't that just extraordinary? And isn't that something that just is not talked about enough, right?
Yes.
I don't understand why that conversation is not allowed, not pursued. And I'm so happy to be having it with you. You had a kind of rough time in your teens. You're a child of the 60s. I mean, you're whatever. And was part of it just that? Part of it, well, maybe a sum of having grown up in, quote unquote, the refugee camp of Little Havana, having grown up with your father, having abandoned, having grown up with your mom, not adjusting and having the issues that she had. All of those things led to your having to really find yourself.
Absolutely. And the 60s defined me tremendously. I was very taken up by the freedom that I saw in the larger culture. I also loved the rock music. I loved Joan Baez, and I loved Carole King, Jimi Hendrix. I just loved the psychedelic life. I loved the freedom. I just loved what was happening with the women's movement, with the Chicano movement, with the gay movement. Every movement in the world, they were clamoring for rights and identity, and so was I. It was happening in my own little world in this Cuban culture where people weren't thinking about that. They were thinking of working, or girls my age, they were thinking they had to get married or they couldn't get pregnant and all of these things. And to me, it was just so much more important to thinking about what the 60s was doing to all of us. especially to me at the time. And that's where I feel really, really American. And a lot of my friends in the ghetto do not. They're more identified with it. So they're more at home in their skins than I am. They feel great. No problem.
So I think if I hear you correctly, what you're saying to me is the more you're exposed outside of the world of your Cuban ghetto into a true Americana, if you will, the more it complicated your image of yourself and who you were and finding that identity. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely. Absolutely so. Everybody else seems to have such a more simpler life than mine. They just stayed in Little Havana. They got jobs around. They moved within the neighborhood. And that's it. They don't have all these questions.
Yeah. Well, that happens to anybody who is exposed. Life isn't simple the more you're exposed. I think that we both agree on that. This book that you wrote, Leaving Little Havana, it's your story. It's the memoir of, as we've been discussing, a Cuban refugee's search for her identity and the quest to find her way in the world. But I have to tell you, Cecilia, it's also a historical account of the boatloads, and pun intended, of young Cubans like yourself forced to find a current that you could forge between the old ways and the new ones. And
yes.
Bottom line for you, the most difficult part of that path.
The most difficult part was, I guess, getting the courage to say to my father, you're not going to pay my college. I don't want to stay in town. I'm going to save the money and I'm leaving no matter what. And he's a pretty scary person. He's very conservative, right-wing, very powerful, very dynamic, charismatic, all of those things. And I don't even know how I found the courage to go ahead and do this, much less to take off like that.
And you did. You took off. You went west. You got yourself an education.
West to even more freedom,
right,
where everything was even doubly free than maybe the Northeast, than maybe Arizona. And that also made a huge impact, going to the University of California in Berkeley, of all places, where liberalism was born, really, in the United States, and going to see the Free Speech Park, which was not far from my house, and having Patricia Hearst be kidnapped in the first 2 weeks that I was there. She lived a few blocks from my house, and learning about the Symbionese Liberation Army and why they wanted to get some food to the poor. All of this stuff is just not heard of in Cuban Miami. And so this opened a lot of worlds for me. And then when I took classes, I got to read about Karl Marx. And the whole thing about Cuba is that obsession with communism. Anything that looks or smells like left wing is communist, and you have to turn your back on it. You have to avoid Obama because he's socialist and communist, and all of these things just were so impactful in my life, and that I went to a class and actually studied Karl Marx and put it on my bookshelf, and my father saw it when he came to visit me that Christmas. That is mind-blowing. And what he did is he took Karl Marx's the Communist Manifesto, I can see it today, I went like, he just put it back on the shelf and never mentioned it. So maybe he just gave up hope for me.
So at the end of the day, having gone through this life of yours thus far, do you feel that this land, America, is your land? As, let's say, I do, having grown up being, born, raised American. Has America been truly welcoming to you, truly accepting, do you think, of the Cuban refugees forced to flee the tyranny of Castro? So it's a two-edged sword. How do you feel about America, and how do you honestly believe most Americans feel about Cuban refugees?
I feel very passionate about this country. I love the freedom here, and I love the opportunity that I had to develop myself as a writer. Had I been in Cuba, none of this, I think, would have happened to this degree. But in the beginning, I believe that people were more accepting of the Cuban refugees. I think now that there are so many refugees from so many parts of the world, and the immigration issue has gotten such a bad image, I think it's very different now, how people look at Cuban refugees. Also, I want to say that the very first migration of Cubans were after the landed aristocracy got here. The middle-class professional, which was where my parents fit in, arrived with college degrees and professions that they made over again. So it was a different kind of maybe class that arrived at that very early time, whereas now it's more what the Statue of Liberty says, give me your poor and huddled masses. And this is where I think America can't accept it. I teach also in several colleges, and some of my students always ask, well, what about the jobs for America? They're being taken by the new immigrants to this country. It's such a complex issue, and it's also very emotional. But I do want to say that America has also given me the opportunity to raise my children in this environment. And however, I'm still not of America fully. My daughter had the great opportunity to go to Princeton University. And when she graduated 2 years ago, I was sitting in the audience with the cream of the crop of the United States of America, people whose ancestors had come off of the Mayflower or who had come in 1776 or whatever. And I just felt like a total outcast. I felt like, what the heck am I doing here? And I was legitimate. I was the mom of this kid who also went on stage to get her diploma from one of the best universities in the world. Yet I just felt my otherness very, very strongly.
2 quick questions. What does Cuba mean to you now?
Cuba now is an island so far off in my consciousness. However, I'm still very interested in everything that happened. I went back in the 1980s. However, I played a lot. I went to the beach. I got myself a boyfriend. I rented a Russian car and drove up and down the island, just like any other typical American would do. Most people of my generation and of my parents' generation would call me a communist and say that that was the most terrible thing I could have ever done is go back to communist Cuba. So it's a complex bundle of feelings that I have for this island.
And my last question to you was this. Where do you live now? Are you still in Little Havana? Are you still in Miami?
No, and I wanted to get this in. After being about 7 years in California, I was missing so much that stupid things like the Cuban coffee and the screaming from Cuban parties. And I missed Miami very much. And I came back as a professional and I started working in television. And I did not go back to live in Little Havana. I live in Weston. I'm west of Fort Lauderdale. So while I'm trying to get away from Little Havana and Miami, I'm pulled back in. And then I feel like I have to go to Broward to still get away. So as you can see, I have not come to terms with a lot of these issues.
I've been speaking with author Cecilia M. Fernandez, whose book, Leaving Little Havana, a memoir of Miami's Cuban ghetto, is an intersection of the stories of the United States and Cuba in the 50s and 60s, the first Cuban immigrants forced to leave the shores of their crocodile-shaped island, and Cecilia's own riveting tale of growing up in the Cuban ghetto. For more information on Cecilia and her work, visit her website at ceciliamfernandez.com. Ana Sophia Pelaez grew up in a famous Cuban family as the great niece of the revered avant-garde painter Emilia Pelaez del Casal. Raised in Miami and transplanted to New York, Ana Sophia launched her food blog, Hungry Sophia, in 2008 in an effort to discover the rich smells, heady flavors, and Baroque rituals of Latin food. Since then, she's been featured in the New York Times, InStyle magazine, The Huffington Post, Food 52, Apartment Therapy's The Kitchen, iVillage, and NBC Latino. She's appeared on the cooking channel Stay Hungry campaign and Aaron Loves New York with chef Aaron Sanchez. Most recently, Hungry Sophia was nominated by Saveur magazine as one of the best regional cuisine blogs. Her book, The Cuban Table, a celebration of food, flavors, and history with photographs by Ellen Silverman, is a gem, a visual as well as gastronomic pleasure, and Ana Sophia's new book. So, Ana, you were born and raised in Miami, and yet Cuba, as you say in the intro to your just gorgeous book, The Cuban Table, a celebration of food, flavors, and history, was never far from your thoughts or conversations or kitchen table. Why is that tiny little island still so much a part of your family's culture so many years after the revolution? And in fact, you asked your grandfather, I thought this was fascinating, this is in the book, who had taught him to cook, and he answered exile.
Something I realized when I was researching the book is how recent it was that they had come to the United States when I came along. I was born in the mid-70s. So it was a relatively small period, and I don't know that I appreciated that until I started researching the book, because I started to see how late the things that I had taken for granted as having always been part of Miami and South Florida, how late those came along as far as finding the fruits and the vegetables and the things that they'd missed. So I think the reason these things were so alive to them is because they were rediscovering them, and they were so excited to see them and have them be a part of their lives again. My mom tells a story about not being able to find mamey's and finally having mamey's in Mexico, and how thrilled she was. And to me, I took it for granted that you could always go to a grocery store and have it, any Cuban product you could possibly want. Beyond Cuba, any Latin American product you could possibly want. So I think they were very young in their exile when I was born, and that's something that I've only gotten my mind around recently.
Yeah, fascinating. Talk to me about Cuban food. What is Cuban food? What are the roots of Cuban food?
I'd say the roots of Cuban food are, it's always the trinity of Spanish, African, and the indigenous vegetables and fruits that were already there. It's very much like the music. It's some very set repertoire, and it's a lot of variation. So it's fairly simple, but at the same time, I think it very much hones in on what the ingredients are and getting the most out of them. So you're frying a lot of vegetables, but you're doing it in such a way that your technique is down perfect, and it doesn't take on too much oil, and it's very crisp and it's very light, and you can basically make any vegetable in that way. So if it's malanga or yuca or the tostones that we have with everything, or the plantains, you have so many of the same things, and yet I never get tired of it. The same thing with the black beans. I think no bowl of black beans is the same to me. There's always something there that you just really enjoy them. There's such a complexity there, even though it's relatively few ingredients. It's the sofrito of the pepper and the onion and the garlic, and then it's just all timing.
Interesting. So let me go this with you. Since so much of Cuba has come to Miami, to the America, has it been hybridized now again, the food?
I think it's renewed constantly in a way. I think there's now so much that you can get in Miami that you can grow in Miami and Florida, that there's not a lot of things that you have to compromise on as far as like using the same ingredients. It's not the same thing, for example, as you lived in southern Italy and you find yourself in Brooklyn. It's still relatively, the climates are similar. There's a lot of things that you can manage in Miami the same as you can in Cuba, maybe a little bit more in Miami.
So it hasn't really had to hybridize that much. What ingredients would people find in the Cuban kitchen that you wouldn't find in another food besides rum?
Well, always rum.
Always rum.
But the mountain of plantains, I think, I love buying plantains because you can just get them green, and then a lot of times you buy fruits, you buy vegetables, you get very excited, you see something, and then it gets away from you, or you don't get to use it. Plantains, it doesn't matter. They can just ripen for weeks, and there's always, at every stage, you can use them in some way, which I love. You're going to find yuca. You're going to find malanga. Those are always the basics. There's always beans, and I feel like there's beans that are always kind of being cooked, but then it's just you're stockpiling them in the freezer. The pre-packaged seasonings, I think you're always going to find the oregano and the cumin and the sazon and the accent and the bijol that you use for all of the rice dishes. Those are always the staples in the pantry, and a lot of sweet. Like, I feel like we definitely, you can tell we come from a sugar country because our tolerance for the amount of sweetness in food is very high. So I think you'll always have the flan that was just made, or the natillas, or some variation on that. That's always part of the kitchen.
Oh, the desserts, the flan. Listen to me. Creativity runs in your family, and your artistry, by the way, is evident in your cooking talents. So how'd you get started in the kitchen? Didn't it all start with what? Your family, and then a blog that catapulted you into? I love the story. Talk to me.
Well, I think it started with, I had always cooked with I didn't cook with my grandparents. I would watch them cook. They would set me up in the kitchen with them in the little yellow chair that they had for me. Well, my grandparents, they started cooking, as I said, once they had come to the United States, that's when they really learned to cook. And it was something that they really loved, and it was something that they fell in love with late in life. And it became very much a passion for both of them. These are my paternal grandparents. So I think the care that they took with what they were doing was something that was very much imprinted in my memory of them. So when I decided to cook and I inherited their Sunbeam mixer, and I started thinking about all of these things that, I wasn't having having anymore because I lived in New York, and because when I would go home, there was always, I would always go to the restaurants where I would, eat with family, but it wasn't the same as having it every day, or having the ritual of the Cuban lunch that took all day to make, or having it be a part of my everyday life. So teaching myself these recipes was really what started my blog. And then because I grew up in Miami with so many other Latin American nationalities, I kind of expanded my search. But my first love was always Cuban food, and it was always about comparing how our natilla would be different from what they would have in Colombia, or the flan would be different, or, what we think of as, we have different names for everything. So we call it malanga and they call it yatilla. So there was always that point of comparison where I feel like when you would see these differences between the countries, there's always a story there as to why that difference was, that I found interesting. But it always started with Cuba and wanting to learn how to make these dishes that I missed, that I wasn't having anymore after, my grandparents weren't there.
And there you go. So listen, so you meet photographer Ellen Silverman, most noted for her contribution to Gwyneth Paltrow's My Father's Daughter, who had recently visited Cuba. And you two set out to create the ultimate Cuban cookbook. And can I tell you something? You did. This is a gift. I'm so lucky. I have it sitting here right on my desk with me. It is gorgeous. It is fabulous. And the recipes, oh my gosh, they're wonderful.
Thank you.
Really, really a great book. Talk to me about that collaboration. You two go to Cuba. You went to Cuba once a few years before that, but you did do your research in Miami and ultimately went back to Cuba. Talk to me about that.
Well, it started in New York, and then I worked my way to Miami, spent a lot of time in Miami, and then eventually, I had to go to Cuba. I wanted to really look at where Cuban food was now. So much of it is colored by the past and kind of on hold in a way. So I really wanted to get kind of a sense of what we were doing right now everywhere. So I went to Cuba first with my family, and then Ellen joined me in Cuba, and we started in the city, in Havana. And in Havana, was very difficult because we were very dependent on eating in restaurants and paladares, and sometimes in people's homes, but it's very difficult. You can't make a plan to just go to somebody's house for dinner, because even people who are more or less comfortable, or who can more or less get everything that they need, there's no extra. There's nothing that they can offer guests. So you didn't want to be a burden for, to them, because they chose to help you. Once we left the city, there was less, but what we found was better, in the sense that people were very close to the food that they were growing, and if they had farms, they could have animals. They had a very direct access to things. And in that sense, it opened up a lot to me, because you could see the techniques. So like the technique of cooking the pork in its own fat. If you're making something a little bit more complex that requires a lot of ingredients, in Havana at least, even in a restaurant that should have access to as much as you could possibly find, they're going to be able to find it. There was a lot missing. If you're in the country and you're raising that pig, and the pig has everything it needs, just needs a little bit of salt, but you raise it, it's eating the palmiche, which is from the palm trees, the royal palms, and you're cooking it in its own fat with a little bit of salt, then it's going to be as good as it can be. And it's about the technique that you apply to cook that food, not about having a lot of different ingredients or access to a lot of different things.
Oh gosh, I'll tell you, boy, that would have been amazing for you to be able to watch that done in its purity like that. Wow, I'm envious. Let's get back to Cuban Americans struggling to maintain their identity over several generations. You say in your intro to the Cuban Table, a celebration of food, flavors, and history, that food is a pure expression of the culture left behind. I love this sense of pride. Here's where I want to go. In your opinion, are most Cuban Americans still hoping for the day when they can return to their island, or going back to Cuban Americans struggling to maintain an identity, and that identity over several generations? You say in your intro to the Cuban Table that food is a pure expression of the culture left behind. That's a quote. I love that. Here's where I want to go with it. In your opinion, are most Cuban Americans still hoping for the day when they can return to their island? You had, as a famous chef and culinary historian, Maricel Priscilla, wrote the foreword to her book. So here's what she said in the foreword: "We are a pragmatic people, but we yearn for the Cuba of our imaginations." Yikes. Talk to me.
Ford was wonderful. She's really incredible. I mean, I think that really says it. To me, the Cuba in my imagination is a Cuba that's at peace, a Cuba that has kind of seen its way through the last 50 years. They're just going from crisis to crisis that it's been living, and a Cuba that kind of rejoins the rest of the world and is participating in it. So in that sense, I think that's the kind of Cuba that I want to see Cuba return to its place. As far as a literal return to the island, I can't speak for everyone. I think we all want to have a sense that we are living our culture in a way, that the values that we think of when we think of Cuban, what it means to be Cuban, that we've maintained those, that hasn't been lost. I see Miami, especially in the last few years, there's been, there used to be, when I was growing up, there was a real divide between exile and Cuba. You didn't get a sense of what was happening in the island with certain, big events like the Mariel boat lift, the 94 Barcelo crisis. I feel like that started kind of opening it up. We would almost see kind of these, like, suddenly it would appear to us and you would get a sense of how people were living. And so you always had a sense of what was happening on the island. Now I feel like, I heard a joke once and it goes back and forth, but like when Cuba catches a cold, Miami sneezes. So in that sense, I feel like there's not this stark division anymore. So the sense that you have to kind of go back to experience Cuba, I think it's that urgencies. It's not as urgent anymore, because if you live in Miami, you're living in Cuba in a sense. You're interacting with mostly Cubans. A lot of the structures are very Cuban. The places where you can go, the people that you see, you live a very Cuban life in Miami, or you can choose to. So I feel like in a way it's almost like, Cuba's expanded in a way into Miami in a way that, I don't know, maybe there's not that sense of like, I literally have to return to once again being Cuba. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who do feel that way and would want to go back. And I think it's a very individual choice that people would make. And I think it changes with each generation. And I don't know that my grandparents would have believed that I would feel as strongly about Cuba as I do. I think they'd be happy about that, but I don't think that they would have thought that, this many years into it, it would be as important to me as it is.
Well, so here's what I was going to say. What I was going to say is, picking up a glass of rum and I'm saying a toast that all Cubans can sit at the table with Sophia and her new book with the wonderful recipes, The Cuban Table, a celebration of food, flavors, and history, together.
Thank you. Hopefully.
Soon. And soon. I've been speaking with Ana Sofia Pelaez, author of The Cuban Table, a celebration of food, flavors, and history, with photographs by Ellen Silverman by way of St. Martin's Press. For more information about Ana and her book, visit her website at hungryassophia.com. Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo was born in Havana, Cuba. He graduated from the University of Havana with a degree in biochemistry. Around 2000, he began working as a freelance writer, photographer, and dissident blogger. In 2010, he founded the independent opinion and literary e-zine Voces, which was Cuba's first digital magazine, and is produced in PDF format, copies circulating in Cuba, on CDs, flash drives, the domestic network known as the intranet, and through photocopied paper editions, because the government blocks access to the dissident servers, although people on the island can access the magazine through proxy servers. Lazo was also the author of Boring Home, awarded the Czech Literary Award, Novelis de Gavita. His latest release is an anthology he edited, an English-language translation of stories from Cuba, Cuba in Splinters, 11 stories from the new Cuba. So Orlando, had a boy raised in Cuba under the thumb of Castro's regime come to question the ideas of the entrenched revolution? Talk to me about that.
First of all, Cuba is a country that has been changing a lot, even when it is a very closed society under a regime that lasts now for more than 55 years. But the influence of ideology, especially in the youth, is almost zero. What we have now in Cuba is pure discipline, pure simulation, and of course, pure repression to all kind of independent manifestation or freedom of expression. No? So many of my colleagues in university, when I was a scientist, biochemist, and then when I was a writer too in Cuba, a blogger, most of them didn't agree with the official policies, with the cultural policies, with the ideological and radical speech of the revolutionary government. So, however, only very few of them, including me, were willing to risk or to express openly in public, and therefore somehow remain outside of the institutional system that is my country. And that's one of the saddest things in my country, that many people are willing to live in a much more ample, tolerant society, but they are not behaving as free citizens. And therefore, the changes in Cuba have been so much delayed. So we are social activists, or in my case, as an independent writer in Cuba, we are not heroes at all. We are just trying to open spaces that could be useful for my society in the near future and also for the community. It's more than a couple of millions Cuban dispersed in the planet, that they have perfectly right to participate in the national life of my country. And right now they are treated like in an apartheid regime. They are not invited to be part of the national life. So all these energies made me think that it was worthwhile to take some risk and be a voice that could communicate and to somehow could put into the public opinion these very important issues of this fundamental moment in the history of the revolution.
Quickly, tell me this, percentage-wise, out of the people who are there, how many do you think really are behind Castro versus they're under the thumb of Castro? Can you give a percentage in your opinion?
The figures in a totalitarian countries are misleading. Let's say 10 years ago, Fidel Castro made like a plebiscite without the due requirements, but it was like a plebiscite. And he collected 8 million signatures on his behalf. And the same applies with other totalitarian regimes. Suddenly, when the government makes like a survey, they get 99%. We have like a kind of a phony election system in Cuba.
Well,
and
sure.
Usually
Yeah.
we will get 95%, 90% supporting the system. But at the same time, we are migrating and escaping our country in an stampede during many years. During the last year, more than 200,000 Cubans left only through legal ways, because we have a lot of escaping, defecting in different other countries. So I cannot tell you sincerely that question. I can only tell you that my friends, even when I was a biochemist working in an official institution, all of them were not sympathizers of an old revolutionary socialist idea. They were not capitalist or free market because they didn't know which were the alternative, but they were willing not to be living in a society where you have only one press, only one TV station, only one party, only one main goal as a country. You cannot create alternative landscapes in the civil societies. And this is very sad.
Absolutely. So you become a dissident, and I imagine everybody around you, your family, your friends, said, shut up. What are you doing?
Yeah,
right?
No, they did. My family, my mother, my neighbors, people that loved me, recommended me, you are committing a mistake. You cannot change the system. We are not telling you that you are not right, but you cannot change the system. And it's not wise for a young person with a career that could be an important intellectual in Cuba. It's not wise for you. So somehow they were fostering in me what we call in Cuba double moral or hypocrisy. Behave as the official institutions or the official government or whatever wants you to behave. And at some point, maybe I could be traveling to America like I am doing now and just stay abroad or travel back to Cuba with some money and do not get into trouble and travel outside again. So this is the logic. And maybe this is the majority of the Cuban people. In this case, yes, we could talk about the majority, musicians, visual artists, professionals, sportsmen, are traveling abroad, getting some money in the market society and going back to Cuba to remain silent, to build, because the rents in Cuba, the prices, everything is lower, of course, than in the first world. And with a little money, maybe with $1,000 in Cuba, you will be able to live for several months, no? So there is like an implicit logic where the wisest thing is to remain silent and to improve yourself, find an opportunity, a space for being quiet and waiting, because there is a very important book by Rafael Rojas, a Cuban essayist, The Art of Waiting. And that's what we are doing as a people. And we can talk about the majority, including the members of the Communist Party. We are waiting for something to change, but nobody really is acting as a community to bring those changes into reality.
The reality is you were arrested 3 times on the island, and your family and friends have been harassed by Castro's secret agents. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, in my case, I can assure you that was nothing compared with what is happening to my colleagues, journalists. I have friends like Calixto Ramon Martinez, who has been for almost a year in jail without charges and then released because there were no charges. It's only coercion and intimidation. I was arrested during the visit of the Pope Benedict XVI to Cuba in March 2012 during 4 days preventively. So I was walking in the street with my girlfriend that has nothing to do with civil society, and we were arrested without the right to make a phone call. We were technically disappeared. Nobody disappears in Cuba. We are not living in an extreme right-wing dictatorship, but we were disappeared for 3 days. And those kinds of things are really worrying me for the near future of my country. And the same happened in another moment in front of my house, in front of my mother, which is now 78, and my neighbors with the motorcycles, patrol cars. Suddenly it looked like I had committed a terrible international crime, maybe. And they were only trying to scare, not me, but the community, so that they knew that they shouldn't be shaking hands with me or giving some information for me to write, because I was a threat to the community, because that police display could only mean that something very terrible was around me. So is it like bullying? No, the state, it behaves like a bullying or intimidating the citizens. And indeed, they are trying not to create independent citizens. I was treated like they call it deposit. So the police is not talking to you. You will not see no lawyers. The officials of the state security are not talking to you. You are just in a deposit. And after 2-3 days, depending each of the 3 cases, you are released without a document to prove that this is true, what I'm telling to you, and without charges. So where are we living? In the rule of law or in the rule of loyalty to the remains of the Castro regime?
Right. Your commitment to a free Cuba remains very strong, obviously. And your latest achievement, by the way, Cuba in Splinters, 11 Stories from the New Cuba. What an anthology. I have to say, wow, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful writers. God bless.
Thank you.
Displaced Cuban authors, a group you call Generation Year Zero.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about this generation and what they're up to, and how words in the revolution and literature is a way. It's a way. It's a way.
During the last 10 years, what we call in Cuba the years zero or the 2000s, because of the 000, and also because somehow we are like a generation that is cutting all kind of bridges and even is struggling with or against the literary tradition in Cuba, and even with the notion of Cubanness, striving with the stereotypes of what is expected to be a Cuban when you go to the foreign editorial markets or to the foreign academics. What do they think and how they interpret our reality? And this not so young sometimes, because some of them are now in their 30s, in their 40s, but really they are writers that are starting in their careers. And we little by little got to know each other through different independent digital magazines that we were publishing completely illegal in Cuba. These are not dissident magazines like Voices or Voces magazine. These were Cacharros, The Revolution Evening Post, 33 and a Third, and a lot of crazy names and titles that we were putting with a very modern design and trying to dynamize a little and hopefully to put a little of commotion to the Cuban literature. Then we were delivering some readings in private spaces because we were not allowed to do so in the cultural institution. And we said, okay, we have something in common. We are very different as writers, as narrators, but we have the intention of provoking a short circuit and trying to refound, if that is possible, the conceptions of what could be fiction in a society so close as Cuba. And so that's how when I got the opportunity to be in New York, I met John Oakes from Our Books in New York, and he was happy to translate, thanks to the excellent translation of Hilary Gully, these 11 stories from a Cuba that certainly I think that will be surprising for a reader that is accustomed to much more conventional narratives coming from the island.
It's truly phenomenal. I have to say, I don't have time all the time to go through everything, but I got hooked. I got hooked. I know you want to reach the Cuban people. That's the goal. make some changes. You're a visiting fellow, by the way, of the International Writers Project, Department of Literary Arts, Brown University. Well, that's impressive. So I have to ask you, from the new perch, looking at Cuba from the outside in, have your thoughts changed?
I have to confess that some days I wake up very, very hopeful. Many colleagues are traveling abroad. We are establishing new projects to support civil society in Cuba. But others day, I wake up completely skeptical. I see that the government is learning how to deal with this transition period. They are designing a very well-conceived transition, in my opinion, keeping their ideological socialist speech, but with a completely market state capitalism economy without free markets, with state control markets. And this is not new. This is not original. We can find those kind of economies in Asia, in China, in Vietnam, and other countries. And in my opinion, the Cuban government is strongly in need for investment in Cuba, but they are not willing that the Cuban people could invest in Cuba, or that the Cuban exiles could invest in Cuba. They are asking for foreign money, including American money, because there is a lot of lobbying against the U.S. economical sanctions against the Cuban government, and they need that money to grow stronger their state control apparatus, and of course they are very deteriorated economy right now. And then I think, oh my God, everything that we are doing is striving for fundamental rights, because we are not politicians. We are only striving for a frame where the rule of law could be respected in my country, and then maybe we will become politicians. But we don't have the frame now to that. Maybe that frame will never come to my country, or it will take 20 more years, because it's very likely, and I have to say this, that there could be a transition in a dynastic way, because the sons and daughters of Raúl and Fidel Castro are now in very important military, economical, and civil positions in my country.
What do you think of the United States' role in all of this? Do you believe it would be helpful for the U.S. to normalize relations with Cuba, or what?
It's a very complex answer. I am completely in favor of the freedom of travel of every citizen in the world, including American citizens traveling to my country. I do not favor isolation or trying to starve people with economical sanctions. But the point that needs to be considered is that right now, and during the last 10 years, United States is already our 6th or 7th commercial partner. Only that Cuba doesn't have credit, financial credit. Indeed, the Cuban government doesn't pay to the European enterprises, etc. No, so only that every time we buy food or devices or some medicines to the United States, we need to pay in cash, and then a ship will go to Havana Bay and deliver the products. So it's not normal. But we are already buying, and I was already eating California apples in Havana. So the embargo is a relic from another time, and it could be or not lifted. And in any case, we are ready, or we pretend to keep striving for attaining the fundamental rights and to remove and to lift the real embargo, the real blockade, which is the blockade that the Castro regime has with the rights that we Cubans have to have rights. Only that. The right, as Oswaldo Payá said, to have rights. Then let's see what happened with our national life and with the relation with the United States. But right now, the popular will cannot even be expressed in what design of a society we really want.
Orlando, can you go back? Do you want to go back, or do you prefer to stay outside and work from the outside in? What's your situation in all of that?
Yes, I came to the United States with a temporary visitor's visa. I thought I was going to be here for 3 weeks. That turned into 3 months. That maybe will turn into 3 years. I was planning to go back to Cuba during the summer, but many friends and colleagues and members, prominent leaders of the civil society were telling me, okay, you have been granted the fellowship for writing in the literary arts department in Brown University, where I am right now. And everybody knows that in Cuba, the government will hamper, as they have been doing to other activists, will delay your next permission to travel abroad. So you will lose that opportunity. Come to Cuba if you want, but you have to know that opportunity for writing and publishing books in America and talking to academics and students about the Cuban issues will be lost. And then I took the decision to remain, at least for the next semester here in Brown University. And then because there is like a migratory reform in Cuba, I still have 1 year to make the decision of legally going back to Cuba. If that year goes by, then I will need to make another special tramit that will be much more complicated. And I will be considered a real exile. Right now, I'm still, in terms of the Cuban government, as a temporary traveler abroad.
You risk the chance of never seeing your family again, no?
I'm really worried about that.
I've been speaking with Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo, author and editor of the new book, Cuba in Splinters, 11 Stories from the New Cuba, and photographer whose current project is Abandoned Havana. For more information on Orlando, visit his website at Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo, blogspot.com. Michael Connors has more than 30 years of experience in writing, consulting, and teaching in fine and decorative arts. He's authored many books, including Caribbean Houses and The Splendor of Cuba, both published by Rizzoli, with a foreword by Ricardo Pura, a Cuban-born architect designated as the head of design for Havana's National Schools of Art, who now lives in Paris, and images by Nesta Marti, a photographer living and working in Havana, whose work has been published in a wide range of books and magazines. Connors and Company are out with a new book, Havana Modern, 20th Century Architecture and Interiors, a book that spans the early 1900s to 1965, a lavish volume that offers a thoughtful survey of the modern movement in Cuban architecture. Michael Connors, I have got to tell you that this book is gorgeous, a feast for the eyes. The images are just extraordinary. Lavish, unprecedented tour of some of the most architecturally significant private homes and buildings that remain in Cuba. How did you pull that off?
Through experience. I've been in Cuba for, going down for 15 years now. So I've sort of gotten a feel for where to go and whose door to knock on.
Is it a friendly place to people like you?
One of the things, I've been to every island in the Caribbean basin, whether I've sailed in or flown in. And people ask me, what is it that you like most about Cuba? And of course, I like the rum, I like the music. Oh my God, the music's great. I love the cigars. But it's the people that I love the most in Cuba. And I have, over the years, become friends, good friends with many Cubans, and it's almost become a second home for me.
Oh, lucky you, lucky you, lucky you. Can I go with you on that sailboat that's going to take me to Cuba and join you?
Well, look, there's room for two.
There's room. Okay, I like the way that sounds. I just love the way that sounds. So listen to me. The book is a thoughtful survey of the modern movement in Cuban architecture, covering the Art Nouveau, my favorite, and Art Deco, through what you call the flowering of high modernism just before the revolution. Give us an overview.
Well, as you may and probably know, every period in both art, decorative art, and architecture is an embellishment of the preceding period or a reaction against it. So in the 20th century, we have in the beginning the Beaux-Arts that turned into the Art Nouveau, and then as a reaction against the curvilinear undulating line of the Art Nouveau was the straight lines of the Art Deco. But then the Art Deco turned into something else. It turned into a very modern, streamlined look. And this modern, streamlined look became the architect's idea of form over function. So it was all about the form. Function wasn't ignored. There were bedrooms and there were bathrooms and all the essential ingredients to a house, but it was the form of the house. And that was what I call the flowering of modernism, that idea of form is more important than the function that takes place with inside.
You know, it's interesting. This generation has a very strange, probably, view of Cuba because we see it through the eyes of politics more than anything, and not a whole lot of photographs. And those that we see probably are showing the dregs of it all. And this book is like going into heaven. It's so gorgeous. The places are so beautiful. And there's
that's so nice of you to say. I appreciate that.
No, and that's true. I'm telling you, I'm like savoring this thing. But you didn't think the Cuban architects had gotten their due. That was part of why you did this book, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And let me just say, addressing your first point, there were great photographers that have taken photos and images, Robert Palladori, Michael Eastman, Andrew Moore. All of these guys have been to Cuba, but they're all taking pictures of the dilapidated buildings and the children with no shoes and the laundry in the courtyard. I wanted to show the other part of Cuba, the beautiful Cuba, and that's what we're doing. We're showing the parts of Cuba that are there. There was no photoshopping done. Well, we did take some electric wires out, but other than that, this is the real Cuba, but it's the part of Cuba that's beautiful. And the architects are there, but, the 1959, three-quarters of the architects had left because their clients had left. So this is preservation by neglect.
Yeah.
It's still there. And it's not being as appreciated as much as the colonial sections. But there is a recognition of it now, and the Cuban people also appreciate it. They know that it's, even though 20th century, they do know that it's part of their patrimony.
There's something interesting. I didn't know this. I didn't know that after the revolution, of course, the government seized commercial assets, but I didn't know that residences weren't seized. So a lot of the members of the upper class who decided to stay are actually still in those homes. Those are the people who gave you access, correct?
Well, that's partially correct. In other words, but if you were part of the upper class or upper middle class, and you had more than one home, you were only allowed to keep one. So there's one home that I point out that was built in the 1920s in the book, and the woman that still lives there, Josie, still lives there, and still there's furniture from the 20s and everything. It was in the book art style. That was one of the houses that I did put in, and it was difficult finding the house. It was difficult getting in. But once we became friends, I had carte blanche throughout the house to take the photographs.
I'll tell you something. The mahogany, the furniture, the detail, the paintings, the flora and the fauna around these homes, everything that shows up in these images, you just keep staring because the detail that's in there, oh my gosh, just extraordinary. That word I keep saying, but it's really, really true. But these are like museums in a way, right?
Well, that's exactly what it is. And then so many people say, oh, well, you can go back to Cuba and it's like stepping back into time. And it is, in a sense, you can step back into time 400 years, you can step back into time 200 years, you can step back into time 100 years, and you can also step back into time 60 years, back into the mid-50s. And that's what I was trying to do with this book. From 1902 to about mid-1960s.
And you hit it.
That's 65 years
yeah.
of architecture.
And some of the things that you uncovered, I was struck by some of the little details. Sand from the Nile River Basin was imported to make the tile grout in one.
Absolutely, and that's part of the research. That's what I enjoy most, really, about these books. Writing is difficult for me. I mean, this is my 9th book, but so many people say it must come really easy to you, but it doesn't come easy to me. Writing's difficult, but the research is easy because I enjoy it so much. And those are the kinds of things that you find in your research, little notes in journals or one thing or another.
And Lalique.
Yeah, Rene Lalique was there. So was Louis Comfort Tiffany. Philip Johnson was there. It's a funny story, but it's in the book. You'll have to really read the book to find the story about Philip Johnson. But he was actually the first architect that was commissioned by Meyer Lansky, the gangster, to build what was going to be the hotel where the Hotel Riviera stands now. Philip Johnson called it the Hotel Monaco, and it's a funny story as to why Lansky fired Philip Johnson, but it's in the book.
It's in the book. I have to tell you my Meyer Lansky story one day, but I can't do it on air.
Okay.
I have a Florida Meyer Lansky story. Cuban ironwork, this I did not know, is extraordinary, and some of the photos in the book that show some of this, exquisite.
Not only the ironwork, but the tile work. Everything of the furniture that was being made in Cuba with that sweet tinea mahogany, wood that was indigenous to the island. It was the wood of choice all throughout the world, and the best mahogany wood came from Cuba. But the ironwork that you brought up, with the Spanish immigration that was happening in the first and second decades of the 20th century, these tradesmen and craftsmen and artisans that were coming from different provinces in Spain, they had been schooled in their trade, and much of that artistry work was imported with the immigrants that came from Spain.
From the political standpoint, you do say this in the book, and rather delicately, I think you did it well. Cuba's socialist government is in favor of what it considers a more pragmatic construction ideal and has since the 60s downgraded the practice of architecture and the role of the architect. Now, this is a sad thing.
It is very sad, and because I've met some young architects there who are unbelievably talented, but because of restrictions in one thing or another, they're hiding their light under a basket. They don't have a choice. To my knowledge, and the last time I was there was 3 months ago, unless things have changed in the last 3 months. But to my knowledge, to have an architectural private practice is still not allowed in Cuba.
Just crazy. How do you, because you spend so much time there, how do you see things going there? I mean, do you think they'll ever get back to I don't know about that, but I can tell you that there are more changes in the last 3 years than the previous 10 years that I've been going down. So things are changing, and the young people want the internet. The young people want their cell phones. They see what's going on in the world now, and they want television. They want internet. They want telephones. So it's going to be the people. It's not going to be the American politicians, and it's sure not going to be the Cuban politicians that are going to change things. It's going to be a movement from the ground up. It's going to be the Cuban people who demand that they want these not just conveniences, but they're necessities in these days. So it's still as much fun though when you go?
I can't tell you how much fun it is. Okay. You've got to meet me down there.
I'm going to do it.
Places in Havana you never thought existed.
I'm going to do it. Maybe we should do a show just on that. I'd be the first person to go there.
I can get you in these places, and you're going to have a ball, and the Cubans are going to love you. I promise you.
Oh, I'm going to love them, too. That's for sure. Let's end on this note, and that is UNESCO in 1982 did designate, and you mentioned this briefly a little bit before, but I want to get back to it, designated Havana a World Heritage Site. Mm-hmm. But you write in Havana Modern that there has been some significant architectural rescue and preservation of old Havana, but you're going to still fight to preserve and conserve and to restore.
Absolutely. Now, let me just say one thing in ending here. I've already started my next book, and the next book is called UNESCO's Caribbean World Heritage Sites. I have chosen 26 sites in the Caribbean basin. 9 of them are in Cuba.
Wow.
9 of the 26 sites are in Cuba. Now, that's a reason for me to go back to Cuba and do more work there.
Absolutely.
But it's going to be an interesting book. But not just Havana, but Trinidad and Camagüey and these wonderful architectural old cities. But not just the man-made heritage sites, but the natural sites too. The reef, for instance, the Gardens of the Queen, this 200-mile reef at the south shore of Cuba. It's one of the, I'm going on now, I'm probably being a little too professorial, but I mean, it will never cease to amaze you what is there in Cuba. Not just the buildings, not just the architecture, and not just the natural sites that haven't been touched, and the beautiful reefs and ocean, but the people, too. Wonderful, wonderful people.
I've been speaking with Michael Connors, author of Havana Modern, 20th Century Architecture and Interiors by way of Rizzoli. Give yourself a treat. Experience the beauty of the Cuba left behind with this wonderful book. For more information, visit michaelconnorsinternational.com. Before I go, I want to remind everyone that podcasts of current and past shows are always available to listen to free on iTunes under the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is also available for download via Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, BlogTalkRadio.com, and a host of other venues. Google the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, and you will find us. Of course, podcasts of our shows, both past and present, are always posted for your listening pleasure at HalliCasserJayne.com. HalliCasser.com, which I hope you'll visit often for the latest information on our upcoming segments. Oh, and while you're at HalliCasser.com, don't forget to visit my blog to read my latest musings. I'll be back next week, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, for another edition of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Audible.com features over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Stay in touch, won't you? Remember, that's HalliCasser.com. Discover us on Facebook at Halli Casser-Jayne and on Twitter at HalliCJ. I love to hear from you. So, till we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. It's a wrap.